In the dead of night in Georgia, two white cops pulled over a lone black woman. They forced her to kneel like a dog in the street, then pulled the trigger thinking they'd just taken out some harmless trash. But those fools had no idea they just pointed their guns at the wrong damn woman. Her name? Maya Jennings, former Green Beret, a psychological warfare expert who once made entire battalions lose their minds with a single stare. One second she was the victim, the next, she became the nightmare of an entire system. Blood was spilled, but she didn't fall. What fell was their power, their careers, and the illusion that they were untouchable. ALD, what state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments because hell has just opened its gates. Maya Jennings drove with both hands on the wheel, the folded American flag still resting on the passenger seat. It was tightly pressed into its perfect triangle, edges crisp, colors faded with time. Her mother's flag, buried that morning with full honors, the flag was all she had left, a name engraved on stone and a legacy carried in silence. The two-lane road stretched out before her, empty and quiet, lined by dry fields and a sky smeared in late afternoon gold. Nothing but the wind hummed through the cracks of the window. Then she noticed the flicker of headlights in her rearview mirror. A patrol car, unmarked, was tailing her without a siren or call. No reason. No flashing lights, just presence. Maya glanced once, then returned her eyes to the road. She didn't speed, she didn't swerve. The vehicle stayed close, too close, and after half a mile it cut in with sudden urgency, forcing her off the road onto a patch of gravel just shy of a utility pole. There were no houses, no stores, no witnesses, no camera poles, just dust and the sound of tires crunching to a stop. She stayed seated, engine off. Hands are still visible. The first officer, Ryan, as the tag would later reapproached fast. No knock on the window, no identification. Just a voice like a slammed door. Step out of the vehicle, now. Maya didn't flinch. Her hands stayed where they were. Her voice, low and steady, responded, "I trained your brother how not to pull the trigger when he shouldn't." Her tone was not defiant, just certain, measured. Behind Ryan, the second officer stood further back. Dugan. His hand was near his holster but not drawn. He didn't speak. His eyes shifted between Maya and the horizon, as though trying to decipher something in her calm. The silence between them cracked like a bone. Then Maya opened the door and stepped out. She moved slowly, deliberately, unarmed, with no sudden motions. Her boots crunched the gravel as she stood straight, shoulders squared. There was no resistance in her, yet Ryan surged forward with a grunt and drove his boot into the back of her leg. She dropped to one knee, arms slightly out, balance held. The pain spiked sharply in her thigh, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of a sound. That restraint, that quiet defiance, seemed to enrage him further. The shot came fast, without warning, a dry pop that echoed off the field. Maya jerked as the bullet pierced through the meat of her upper arm. Heat and shock radiated from the wound, blood darkening her sleeve in seconds. She did not scream. She did not beg. Her breath hissed between clenched teeth, her face locked in control. The sun dipped lower as dust floated through the still air. Maya stared at Ryan, who now stood over her with his pistol drawn, his face contorted with something far beyond duty. Dugan still hadn't moved. The only other sound was the whir of the dashcam still recording silently from her vehicle lights. Red light blinking, unseen, but watching. Her body held tension, not from fear, but discipline. A furnace, not a flame. The pain was there, yes, raw and blooming, but so was something older, something steel-forged. Ryan leaned down, voice shaking with fury. The muzzle of his gun pressed against her temple. "Who the hell do you think you are, looking at me like that?" Maya turned her head slightly, the corner of her mouth lifting not in mockery, not in arrogance, but in a quiet answer. "Not who you think." And that was when the wind paused. The road lay still as the sun finally touched the fields. Time held its breath. Who decides what a person is worth, and what happens when they're wrong? The gun still pressed cold against her skin when Maya's eyes locked onto the officer's quote. She said the words not in defiance but in clarity. "Not who you think." He didn't respond. but something in her silence seemed to unsettle him more than if she had screamed. As the sun lowered behind the trees, she stayed kneeling in the gravel, shoulder bleeding, breath measured, spine straight as a mast in a storm. Blood warmed the inside of her sleeve, soaked into her waistband. Still, she didn't blink. Ryan backed up slowly, his expression twisted into something between confusion and control. He reached for the radio clipped to his vest, his voice flat, almost bored. "We've got a suspect here." Threatening posture, requesting backup, immediate. His lie came without hesitation. His words were for the record, for the paperwork later, not for the truth. Maya's mouth remained closed, but her mind was cataloging everything: license plate numbers, badge glint, how the gravel had stuck to Ryan's boots, the exact time on the car clock when they stopped. Every detail pressed into memory like fingerprints in wet cement. Officer Dugan moved next, quietly, reluctantly. He passed Maya, without a glance, circled to her car, and opened the back door. The trunk had already been released. He reached in. When his fingers brushed against the folded military fabric, he froze. The old duffel, its name patch faded but intact, sat next to a pair of boots worn smooth at the heels. His hand hovered above it. Maya turned her head slightly toward him. Her voice came slow and dry, scraped raw from grit and pain. "Touch that, and you'll understand more than you're ready for." Dugan's hand dropped. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered. He looked at her not like a criminal but like someone he'd seen before, maybe in a file, maybe in a memory. His jaw worked a little, then settled. Just beyond the tree line, out of sight but not out of range, a young man crouched low behind a stretch of brush and pine. Kareem had followed the patrol car out of curiosity. It wasn't his neighborhood, but he'd been passing through, phone in his hand, music off, senses on. When he saw the woman pulled over, then saw her shoved down, bleeding, and something clicked. He hit record. His phone shook, but the lens stayed trained on the scene, zoomed just enough to capture every second. From behind the leaves, Kareem whispered to himself, his breath shallow, "Please don't shoot again." He didn't move, he didn't speak loudly, but he didn't stop recording. Maya's body leaned slightly now. Blood loss made the edges of her vision blur, colors softening, sound dulling. The gravel dug into her knee, but it was the heat in her arm that screamed the loudest. Still, she didn't collapse. Not yet. Her lips moved again, barely more than a whisper, but just loud enough for Dugan to hear. "Remember every face." Then her eyes rolled back, and she slumped sideways into the dirt. Her hand twitched once, fingers grazing the edge of the flag still folded in the front seat. Ryan swore under his breath. "Get her up. She's playing possum." But Dugan didn't answer right away. He leaned down, checked her pulse. She was still breathing, slow and shallow. He hesitated. Then, as if shaking off the moment, he looked at Ryan and said quietly, "I think she was military, one of ours." They hauled her up between them. Her boots scraped against the ground, leaving a smear of red behind. The blood trailed like spilled ink across a forgotten page, vivid and silent. They shoved her into the back of the cruiser. Neither man noticed the dashcam light blinking steadily in the windshield. The car engine roared back to life. Dust kicked up as they drove off, tires grinding over loose stone. In the brush, Kareem stayed crouched until the noise faded. He stood slowly. His hands trembled. He raised his phone and faced the camera. "If I don't make it past tomorrow," he said, voice cracking, "someone has to see this video." He stopped recording, held the phone to his chest for a moment, then slipped it into his coat. Wind moved the trees behind him. Somewhere down the road, a crow lifted into the air with a dry screech, and on the shoulder of that quiet road, Maya's blood still marked the gravel, a red line between silence and truth. In moments like these, the world turns not on violence, but on who keeps the record and who dares to remember. The blood had dried, but the truth had not. It clung to the gravel, the video, the silence that followed. Kareem's last words into his phone trembled into the internet like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread faster than anyone expected. Within 12 hours of posting, the video had reached 3 million views on Twitter. People watched it in disbelief. A woman in uniform, calm and unarmed, was shot on a quiet road by an officer who never gave his name. The footage was shaky but clear enough to convict a conscience. Yet not a single news channel aired it. No mention on cable. No panel debates, no breaking news banners, just a growing storm online and a deeper hush in the places where headlines were made. By the next morning, Kareem's social media accounts were gone. not deactivated, deleted. His friend said his phone rang but was never answered. Messages marked as delivered, never read. Then the phone itself disconnected altogether. It was as if the young man who had dared to film had been quietly swept off the board. Maya woke in a room without windows. The light was dim, the air stale, her arm burned, wrapped tightly in gauze, and the scent of disinfectant clung to every surface. She heard the low murmur of a television somewhere down the hallway, a machine beeping rhythmically beside her, but it was the soft, nearly inaudible click of boots outside her door that brought her fully alert. Instinct returned before memory. She was being watched. There was a uniform outside. The officer never entered, just stood there, posted like a statue. No clipboard, no questions, just presence. Maya knew the look. She'd guarded rooms like this in Kandahar, except those rooms held men marked dangerous. What, she wondered, did they think she was? When the nurse finally came in, Maya waited until she turned to adjust the IV. Then, using the strength she barely had, she twisted her body and slipped the tube from her arm. The pain lit up her nerves, but she kept silent. She dropped from the bed barefoot, and with years of training behind every movement, she made her way past the officer, down the hall, and out into the night. No alarms, no chase, just the sharp air on her skin and the sound of her own heart. She headed first to Kareem's last known address. It took hours, 2 changes of clothes, and a back route across 3 neighborhoods. There, in a quiet apartment above a laundromat, she knocked on a door with fading blue paint. A young woman answered, eyes swollen, her voice a whisper before Maya even asked a question. "He told me," the woman said, "that if anything happened, I should give this to you." She led Maya inside to a floorboard that creaked oddly. Beneath it, in a small velvet ring box, was a USB drive. It looked ordinary, but the weight in the woman's hands as she passed it over made it feel like something more than plastic and memory. Back at a borrowed laptop, Maya plugged it in. The files loaded slowly, each folder opening like a sealed envelope. Inside were documents, dozens, names, dates, photos, charts labeled Stop and Assess, with officer quotas listed beside them. A separate sheet cataloged suspicious stops marked with a strange symbolsome kind of code. One entry bore the initials MJ. She opened a file titled Pending Draft. It was an email, unsent. Kareem had written, "I know who's behind it. I'll release everything. If they come for me, this proves I was right." It ended with no signature, just a timestamp, less than an hour before his last video. The room was silent. Outside, wind moved through alleyways, making the drain pipes groan. Maya stared at the screen. Then she opened the final file. It was a video, grainy, shot in near darkness. A man's face never appeared, only his voice calm, measured, deadly clear. "Don't let anyone see that list, especially not Maya Jennings." The screen went black. For a long moment, Maya didn't move. The hum of the old laptop filled the silence like static. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but she didn't close the file. The voice still rang in her ears, not as a threat, as a confirmation. Someone knew exactly who she was, and they were afraid she might still be standing. She placed the USB back in its hiding place, shut the laptop gently, and leaned back in the chair. The dull throb in her arm pulsed with each heartbeat, but it was nothing compared to what now burned behind her eyes. This had never been about a traffic stop. Outside the window, across the street, a mural was half finished, a hand reaching upward, painted in deep tones of brown and red. No face, just the hand, still rising. Sometimes, justice begins not with power, but with proof that someone dared to watch and did not look away. The voice on the video lingered in Maya's mind like smoke, especially not Maya Jennings. She played it once, and that was enough. She didn't need to hear it again. The message was clear. Whoever had built this machine of silence and steel knew her name and feared it. That meant she wasn't just caught in the system, she had become a threat to it. Maya drove through the night, keeping to back roads. Windows rolled down slightly to let in the scent of pine and earth. Her arm throbbed beneath the bandage, but pain was something she'd long since learned to push aside. When the sun rose, it lit up a small brick house with peeling paint just outside Savannah. This was where she needed to go. Doc lived here. They hadn't spoken in years, not since their last overseas mission, but trust forged in fire rarely cooled. Doc was waiting before she knocked. Tall, wiry, older now, but still sharp-eyed. He opened the door, scanned her face, and nodded once. "No names. Just come in," he said. Inside, the living room had been converted into a quiet kind of command post, maps pinned to a corkboard, wires trailing from laptops, medical kits still in military cases. Maya handed him the USB without a word. He plugged it in. The silence, as files loaded, was filled only by the hum of the fan and the ticking of an old wall clock. Doc opened a folder titled Cormorant Protocol, his brow furrowed as line after line of data filled the screen. "This isn't just surveillance," he said. "This is profiling." The protocol targeted veterans, specifically those who had served in combat zones, returned with trauma, and showed signs of instability. The file listed 239 names, most of them Black or Latino, many with military service in Iraq or Afghanistan. Notes beside each name described them as high risk for institutional resistance or elevated non-compliance probability. Some were marked with a simple red check, others had stars, or codes Maya didn't recognize. She sat back, breathing slowly, the weight of each name pressing down like stone. Then her eyes caught one entry that made her hands tremble. Henry Jennings, her father. She stared at the screen, her throat tight. According to the file, he had been detained for 72 hours in 1994 without charges, then released. No record existed in public databases, no explanation, just a mark. Her father had never spoken of it, and now Maya understood why. It had started long before her. Doc kept digging. Another file revealed contracts between Geo Group, the private corporation managing detention center San the state. One clause stood out in thick, bold letters. Minimum occupancy requirement, 89%. Failure to meet the quota will result in state compensation for lost capacity. "They're treating incarceration like real estate," Maya muttered, "like room bookings in a hotel." Doc nodded grimly. "And they're filling those rooms with veterans." The two sat in silence. Outside, a lawnmower buzzed faintly in a nearby yard. Children laughed a few houses down, unaware that entire lives were being calculated in margins and spreadsheets. Maya stood, went to the kitchen sink, and stared at her reflection in the dusty window. She didn't look like a fugitive, but she was now, and more than that, she was a witness. She spent the next hour destroying what remained of her civilian footprint. Bank cards, licenses, Idaho, all shredded and burned. She wiped her phone, then snapped it in half. She cut up old uniforms, even the ones she had folded with care, everything that connected her to the life before gone. When it was done, Doc handed her a blank notepad and a marker. "We'll do this analog," he said. "Map the stops, look for repeats. If there's a pattern, it'll show." Over the next 2 days, they built a map from reports, leaked files, and digital whispers. Highways lit up with small pinpoint where veterans had been pulled over, cited, or vanished. Red strings connected them to counties, then to detention centers, and finally, back to Geo. The pattern was not random. It was deliberate, circular, controlled. On the third morning, Maya walked past a bulletin board outside a gas station, paper coffee in hand. Flyers fluttered in the wind, missing pets, cheap car repairs, and a local fundraiser, but one image stopped her cold. Kareem's face stared back at her from a printed missing person poster. His eyes were clear, steady, hopeful. Below his name, someone had scrawled in thick red marker, "Not an accident." She stared for a long time. The coffee in her hand had gone cold. She reached out, placed her hand gently on the corner of the poster, and whispered, "I know." The breeze picked up, rustling the paper softly. Somewhere behind her, the world moved as if nothing had happened, but Maya knew better now. Some networks are invisible not because they hide, but because people are taught not to look. The wind tugged gently at the corner of Kareem's poster as Maya stepped back from the bulletin board. Not an accident, someone had written. It wasn't just graffiti. It was the truth, placed in plain sight for anyone willing to believe it. She folded the image into her memory and walked back toward Doc's house, coffee cup empty, resolve full. Inside, the map on the wall had grown. Red lines, thumbtacks, names that once meant nothing now formed patterns with weight. Doc sat at the desk, scrolling through the next set of files from the USB. He didn't look up when Maya entered, just said softly, "You need to see this." She moved beside him. On screen was a spreadsheet labeled Strategic Engagement Targets. Every row listed a person, former military, mostly men, many with notes beside their names, few living relatives. documented trauma response, minimal community presence, compliant under pressure. The tone was clinical, cold, as if these were failed parts on a shelf, not people. At the end of each line was a score, likelihood of resistance. Lower numbers seemed to match those who had been apprehended easily. Some names were grayed out, others had red slashes. Maya leaned in. "These are ratings," she said, "like vulnerability scores." "And those?" Doc pointed to the images attached to several entries. Photos appeared: mugshots and post-arrest images, faces bruised, eyes swollen shut, mouths stitched or bloodied. Some looked barely conscious. One man had a hospital gown on in his booking photo, IV still taped to his hand. Another showed signs of restraint burns on his wrists. Maya swallowed the rising sickness in her throat. "They're not detaining, they're breaking people," she said. Doc clicked into another folder, labeled Assignment Flow. This one looked like a task sheet: columns of dates, officer names, and counties. Under each name was a quota, 15 interactions, month. But one column was labeled Response Required, and beside several names was a word Maya hadn't seen before: confirmed physical. "They're rewarding escalation," she muttered. 15 stops aren't enough, unless it ends in a fight. Doc clicked one row near the bottom. A note blinked across the screen, buried inside a comment field. "If MJ reappears, escalate to C-Risk Level 3. He looked up at her slowly. "That's you," he said. "MJ, they've classified you." Maya didn't respond. She stared at the note, breathing slowly, the sound of the house around her dimming. C-Risk. She had heard that term once, long ago, in a different war zone. Back then, it had meant something between dangerous and disposable. Later that day, she began going down the list, name by name. Some she recognized vaguely from past missions, others not at all. But one name stopped her cold: Reuben Carver. The file listed his detainment date as 2017, his status released. But Maya remembered attending Reuben's funeral in 2012. She'd carried his casket with 3 others in full dress uniform, folded the flag, watched his mother sob over the wood. "That can't be right," she said. Doc searched public records. Death certificate confirmed, 2012. Yet here he was processed in a local jail 5 years later, complete with a photo and signature. The hair in the photo was too short, the jaw slightly wrong, a name reused, a record fabricated. Doc leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy with realization. "This isn't just about meeting quotas," he said. "This is a test environment, controlled variables, disposable outcomes." His voice dropped into something more shaken than Maya had ever heard from him. "It's an experiment." They turned back to the wall map. A new layer had been added, routes overlaid in blue, tracing highways and rail lines that fed in and out of private detention centers. When Maya drew lines connecting the arrest sites to these facilities, all the paths intersected at one point. Not a city, not a courthouse. A logistics hub just off a state route owned, as Doc confirmed, by Geo Group. She stepped closer, finger pressing the pushpin into the very center of the web. "All of it," she said. "Every stop, every name, every lie, they all come back here." Her voice was calm, but final. "This is where it started, and this is where I'll end it." She stepped back, eyes on the map, as the sun dipped behind the blinds. The air in the room felt still, waited. Outside, a bird called once, then fell silent. Somewhere far off, a truck passed, tires humming on distant asphalt. Justice isn't always in a courtroom. Sometimes it's a map hand, someone brave enough to follow the lines back to where they begin. The map still clung to the wall behind her, a spiderweb of red and blue, but Maya no longer needed to look at it. The point of origin had burned into her thoughts. It wasn't enough to trace lines anymore. It was time to build something real, to push back. And to do that, she needed ground, familiar ground. 2 days later, she stood before the rusted gates of an abandoned training camp, hidden off a forgotten road just west of Augusta. Time had not been kind to the place. Vines crept over the perimeter fencing, and every step crunched on broken gravel and fallen pine needles. The air smelled of old oil, mildew, and memory. This was where her father had once trained reserve unitsmen who would go on to serve quietly, unseen by headlines. He had taught here for over a decade, and Maya remembered running drills between the barracks as a girl, watching the sunrise from the firing range, and hearing her father's voice carry across the yard like a metronome. Now the building sagged under years of neglect, and the place held only silence. Doc followed behind her, tool bag over one shoulder, tablet in hand. He didn't speak. There was something reverent about returning to a place where so many voices had once filled the air and now left behind only an echo. They got to work. The old generator in the basement of the main hall groaned once, then roared to life after some coaxing. Lights flickered on in patches. Dust stirred in beams of sunlight through broken windows. Maya swept cobwebs from a corner room that had once been an office. She pinned new maps to the walls, rolled out old tables, and turned the space into their war room. They installed basic surveillance-first cameras along the gate, motion sensors across the gravel path. Doc set up radio receivers to scan frequencies used by local law enforcement. Within days, a pattern emerged. Each time a certain tone hit the scanner subtle, buried in regular police chatter, it was followed by a traffic stop involving someone flagged as unstable. "That frequency isn't standard," Doc said one night, turning the dial slowly, ears narrowed. "It only broadcasts when there's movement near major highways, and it spikes near the same locations we've marked for C-risk incidents." Maya stood by the wall, arms crossed, her eyes never leaving the map. "They're not just waiting for resistance," she said. "They're hunting for it." The next night, the wind shifted. Maya sat in the darkened command room, reviewing logs, when her burner phone buzzed unseen unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A voice, low and urgent. "You don't have time left." There was no click, no goodbye, just silence. She stayed still for a moment, then looked out the narrow window. The yard outside was quiet. Pine trees swayed under a half-lit moon, but something in her gut turned. The message hadn't been a warning. It had been a countdown. At midnight, the explosion tore through the far edge of the lot, where Doc's car had been parked. The blast shattered 2 windows and set off the perimeter alarms in sharp, stuttering howls. Maya grabbed her rifle and ran out into the night, but Doc wasn't there. He'd left earlier that evening to gather more equipment. The vehicle was empty when it was hit. Someone had timed it wrong, or Doc had sensed something before leaving. She spent the next hour checking the perimeter, calming the systems, and resetting the defenses. Then she made a decision. If they were coming, she would not just wait. She set up an old field camera in the woods outside the barracks, pointed not at the gate, but at the blind spot near the utility shed, where no one should approach. She wired it to a silent alarm that would buzz only her device. Just after 3 a.m., it triggered. Through the camera feed, she watched a figure move low across the brush, silent, practiced, careful. Whoever it was had training. She let the intruder get closer, past the back lot, into the kitchen storage, where she waited. Then, quick and silent, she brought them down. The struggle was brief. Maya pinned the figure, pulled back the black hood, and paused. The face beneath it was not unfamiliar. It was older now, worn around the eyes, but unmistakable. He had once stood in her tactical operations class 3rd row, always quiet, always focused. His name had been Roy. He blinked in the dim light, caught his breath, then did something she didn't expect. He smiled. "They sent me to kill you," he said, voice flat. "But I owe you my life, so I'm switching sides." Maya hadn't loosened her grip yet. Her heart still raced. The wind outside was rising again. Sometimes the first resistance doesn't come with an army, but with one person who decides to stop obeying the wrong orders. Roy's words echoed in the silence. "They sent me to kill you, but I owe you my life." Maya didn't release him right away. Her training, hard-earned and sharp-edged, kept her hands firm on his shoulders, but there was no tension in Roy's body, no struggle, only the calm of a man who had already decided which side he was on. She stepped back slowly, motioned for him to sit. In the dim light of the command room, his face looked worn, the kind of tired that came from more than sleepless nights. It was the kind that settled in a man's bones after years of obeying orders that never should have been given. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, voice low, "but I figured if anyone would understand, it'd be you." He told his story with pauses, letting the weight of it settle between them. After leaving the military, he drifted. A few security jobs. One contract led to another. Eventually, someone handed him a folder and said it was internal clearance work for a private contractor. GO Group. They used clean words containment, deterrence, fail-safe interventions. But the truth was simpler. He was paid to clean up, to quietly erase those who no longer fit inside the system they were helping maintain. They didn't want activists, Roy said. They wanted ghosts, people no one would look for. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. Some of them were like me, vets, guys who served quiet missions, the kind nobody puts on medals for. One day, they were assets. The next they were liabilities. Maya listened without interrupting. The room was still, except for the occasional buzz of the radio scanner in the corner. Then Roy said something that made her sit up straighter. I can take you to one of the places where they process the data, where the real list lives. The next morning, they drove north in an unmarked truck, winding through back roads into rural Georgia. Rain spat across the windshield. The clouds hung low and heavy, casting long shadows over pine fields and abandoned lots. Eventually, Roy pulled into a gravel lot behind a storage warehouse with no signs, no windows. It looked empty. They entered through a side door, down a flight of concrete steps, into a corridor that smelled faintly of machine oil and dry mold. At the end of the hall, Roy punched a code into a rusted keypad. A door clicked open, revealing a room filled with metal racks, dusty servers humming low like breath through clenched teeth. Maya moved carefully. She found the terminal, one password then another. The screen opened a directory. Project Oubliette, clearance restricted. She clicked through the folders until she reached a document titled List C, Deletion Protocol. 34 names. Every one of them was flagged as completed or pending. All had served in classified campaigns. None had criminal records. Several were listed as disappeared, others labeled as unconfirmed deaths. Some were even still listed as active duty on paper, at least. These people, Maya said quietly, didn't just vanish, they were erased. Roy stood against the wall, face pale. I didn't know it went this deep. Then, he staggered. Maya caught him before he hit the floor. His skin had gone clammy, his breathing irregular. Blood traced a thin line from the corner of his mouth. There's something you don't know, he whispered. They tracked me. I had a chip, internal, wrist. I tried to cut it, but I didn't get it all. Back at the base, Doc worked quickly. They found the chip near Roy's radial nerve, a grain-sized capsule embedded beneath the skin. Maya sterilized the blade. It was crude work, but precise. She removed it in silence, her hands steady, though her jaw clenched tight. Doc placed the chip into a sealed pouch. It was still warm. It's not just for tracking, Doc said after scanning the device. It's reactive, could trigger a cascade, neural, cardiac. They built a kill switch. Roy coughed hard, blood staining the collar of his shirt. I knew. I wouldn't make it long. I just had to get you there. That was the job I gave myself. Maya didn't answer. She helped him into a cot, covered him with a wool blanket. His eyes began to close. But before he slept, he reached into his pocket and handed her a folded slip of paper coordinates, written in ink, now smudged by sweat. If you make it, burn what's left. Later that night, when his breathing quieted, Maya stepped outside. She carved his name into a plank of wood beside Kareem's, same size, same height. Two men on who revealed the lie, the other who once enforced it. Both, in the end, chose the truth. The moonlight caught something on Roy's neck. Maya moved closer. Beneath an old tattoo, faded and warped by time, she saw new ink emerge. Letters, barely legible now, rising through the skin like something remembered. Project Oubliette, do not exist. She ran her thumb gently over the words, then stepped back. Sometimes the bravest choice a soldier can make is not pulling the trigger, but choosing who they will never shoot again. Roy's body was still beneath the wool blanket, breath barely moving, when Maya left his side. The fading tattoo on his neck, do not exist, lingered in her mind like a brand pressed into memory. He had delivered her to the gate of something deeper, darker. Now it was her turn to step inside. The facility stood hidden beneath what looked like a condemned grain warehouse off a rural road in central Georgia. Trees leaned too close, their roots breaking through the gravel like veins under tired skin. Inside, dust floated through slats of broken wood, and the only sound was the faint drip of water from a pipe long neglected. But Roy's directions were clear. Near the back, beneath a rotting desk and half-collapsed shelving, Maya found a square section of floor that sounded hollow when tapped. She pulled it open, Below was a steel stairwell that led down into cold air and silence. She descended carefully. Her boots echoed on the steps. The temperature dropped. At the bottom, a reinforced door, unmarked, opened to the push of her hand. What she saw beyond it froze her in place. A full data center, humming with power. Rows of servers blinked with green and amber lights. No dust, no disuse. Someone had kept this alive. The low thrum of machines filled the air, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. Maya crossed the floor and powered up the nearest terminal. She searched by contract first. It didn't take long. The files weren't hidden, just coldly organized, as if no one expected them to be found. State of Georgia, GO Group, Correctional Services Agreement. The line that stopped her read, Detention Occupancy Commitment, 92% minimum capacity, enforced monthly. Noncompliance will trigger fiscal penalties and suspension of state reimbursement. It was there in plain language. Incarceration, not a consequence, but an economic infrastructure. Maya scrolled further. Another folder opened, Veteran Compliance Research, Phase 2. Within it were reports titled Behavioral Resistance Metrics and Post-Trauma Reaction Analysis. Each file documented the same pattern: combat veterans flagged for nonconformity, subjected to random stops, and monitored for willingness to obey on command. Many had been arrested after minor infractions. Others disappeared entirely. One name stopped her hand: Kareem Washington. Beside his name, a red slash, and the note, Outcome, uncontrolled, terminate with urgency. She stared at the words. Her jaw tightened, not with surprise, but with the weight of confirmation. He hadn't just been collateral, he had been a target. Then she saw her name, Maya Jennings, the note beside it. Dangerous if exposed. Threat level, Alpha. Monitor all communications. Escalate to C. Risk, on contact. Her pulse thudded against her ribs. She leaned back in the chair. A screen of lights blinked softly before her. Her image, calm, unarmed, bleeding, had triggered a cascade of fear in a system designed to erase people quietly. And because she had stood up, they had labeled her the problem. Doc's voice crackled over her radio. What are you seeing? She replied evenly. They didn't come after me because I broke the law. They came after me because I broke the reason this machine keeps running. He didn't answer at first. Then, softly, with the weight of someone who had seen too much, Doc said, You prove their excuse isn't real. That's always been the threat. Maya found a small external hard drive locked in a case beneath the desk. She copied everything, all of it, the contracts, the lists, the notes. Before they left, she pried open a sealing duct near the stairwell and tucked the drive deep inside, past reach, past suspicion. She resealed the vent with care, dusting the cover with her glove. As they exited, Maya noticed something in the airshift. From a distance came the faint thump of rotor blades. They weren't alone. Move, she said to Doc. They ran. Out the stairwell, across the warehouse, back through the broken field. Behind them, a sound cracked like thunder and explosion, then smoke. Part of the warehouse roof collapsed in flames. They didn't look back. The sun had dipped low by the time they made it to the truck. Maya climbed into the passenger seat, heart racing, shoulder tight with sweat. Doc handed her a bottle of water. Neither spoke for a long stretch of road. Then Maya's burner phone buzzed once. No number. She opened the message. By the time you read this, your identity will have been made public. She didn't blink. She locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the dashboard. Outside, the fields stretched silently, vast, uncaring. But somewhere, someone now knew her name and everything she stood against. Even the deepest well cannot drown the truth if someone climbs out carrying light. The message on Maya's phone had said her name was now public. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but when she saw her face flash across a muted television in a gas station later that morning, she knew the warning had been true. Her photo appeared beneath a harsh headline, Former Green Beret, tied to domestic extremist group. The anchor's voice was cold, reading lines prepared long before any real questions had been asked. They showed clips from her military past, grainy images of her in uniform, stripped of context. Then the anchor added, Authorities believe Jennings may be linked to anti-government activity. Maya stood in the corner of the station, hood up, watching without reaction. The cashier barely glanced at her. Another customer filled a coffee cup beside her. Life continued, but the truth had been twisted into spectacle. She returned to the truck and sat silently. Doc waited behind the wheel, engine running low. They made their move, she said simply. Doc nodded. Then, it's your turn. That night, in the makeshift war room, Maya opened her email. One unread message sat at the top of her inbox, from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Don't let them write your story." Inside was a scanned letter. No name, just a signature, a brother, in arms. The handwriting was precise. "You were my commanding officer. I trusted you in fire. Now trust yourself in truth. If you stay silent, they win. Speak. Not for you, for the ones who can't." She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she turned to Doc. "I need to record something." They set up an old camera, nothing flashy, just a chair, a table, and her. She wore no uniform, no makeup, only her expression calm, tired, steady. She spoke plainly. She told the story as it happened, from the moment she left her mother's graveside to the moment the gun pressed against her head. She told Kareem's name, his courage, his warning. She listed facts, not slogans, evidence, not rumors. Then, softly, she asked the question that echoed, "Who profits when people like us vanish?" She sent the video to Alexis Cho, a young independent journalist she remembered from a veterans town hall long ago. Within hours it was uploaded. Within 12, it had spread beyond anything they expected. The silence broke. Other voices joined Hearst commentators, former soldiers, citizens who had lost someone to the system but never knew where to look. People shared the clip, not because it was flashy, but because it felt real, and because it asked what the nightly news refused to. By the end of the week, the media had no choice but to acknowledge it. Sheriff Danvers stood at a podium before a row of cameras. His mouth was tight. His eyes scanned the press, as if trying to shame them into silence. "We reject any allegations made against our department," he said. "This is a coordinated smear. Miss Jennings is a fugitive, not a freedom fighter." But behind closed doors, cracks had started forming. A former patrol officer, young, only 2 years in uniform, leaked a set of emails to a civil rights group. One of the messages read, "Remember, no quota met equals no state budget payout. Keep the trucks full. That's the job." That phrase, "keep the trucks full," hit like a stone in still water. Maya watched it all unfold from the same room where she'd first lit the map with red string and pins. She knew the moment had come. She uploaded her next video. This time she included documents, the detention contract, signatures linking Geo, Danvers, and state budget officials. She didn't yell. She didn't name, call. She showed the paper, read the fine print, and let the camera linger. "Quota," she said. "That word is printed 32 times in this agreement. Not once do you find the word justice." She paused, letting the words breathe. Then she looked directly into the lens. Her voice was low, controlled. "I will go to the place where they write these laws. I will read this contract out loud, and I will ask them, line by line, what it was they signed their names to." She didn't smile. She didn't blink. The screen faded to black. Outside, night had fallen. The world remained loud, chaotic, and uncertain. But the message had been sent. The face on the screen wasn't just a warning, it was a mirror. And the question hung in the air like smoke. When laws are built to serve power, who defends the people they leave behind? The screen had gone black after Maya's final words in the live stream, but the echo of her promise still lingered. "I will go to the place where they write these laws." And now, with the world finally watching, she began preparing to do just that. She drafted the call with Korean open invitation, addressed to every independent journalist, every civil rights group, and every veterans association still willing to listen. It was not a rally, not a protest. It was, in her words, a reading of truth in front of the building where silence has always been law. The message set the time, 10 a.m., Monday morning. The place, the front steps of the state capitol. Her caption read, "Let's meet where no one ever gets pulled over." Doc took over the technical side. They wired the main room with 3 separate streaming systems sewn hardline. One satellite, one tethered to a private, encrypted network. "If they cut one, we have 2 more, he said simply. He worked through the night, checking signals, securing backup batteries, and mounting antennas with the precision of a man who understood what it meant to leave nothing to chance. In the days leading up to Monday, there were no long speeches or rehearsals. There was only the careful gathering of evidence contracts, emails, internal memos, photos of bruised faces, records of manipulated quotas. Maya printed everything in triplicate. One set, sealed and addressed to the national press. Another, for a contact within the FBI she trusted. The third, prepared for satellite transmission in case something happened to her before she could speak. Roy, pale and worn thin from the toll of the implanted chip, spent his last hours writing. His handwriting had grown shaky, but the words were sharp. He handed Maya a small, folded note and said, "My family won't need this, but someone should know I tried to fix it." Maya tucked it into her jacket without a word. That night, Roy's breath grew shallow. He fell asleep without asking for anything, and never woke again. She didn't cry. She took his nameplate, the one she had carved into the wooden board beside Kareem's sand, ran her thumb over the grain. Then she picked up her old boots, caked in the red dust of places she no longer named, and sat quietly as the hours passed. At just past midnight, movement triggered the southern perimeter sensors. Maya was already awake. She and Doc moved quickly, weapons drawn but silent. The intruders came in groups quick, black-clad, organized, but they weren't expecting resistance from two veterans trained to fight in worse places than this. It ended as quickly as it began. Two were knocked unconscious. One fled. The rest were intercepted by the traps Maya had rigged weeks earlier. Doc checked the final tally. Not amateurs. They came to neutralize, not arrest. Maya nodded. They failed. Just before dawn, Malik arrived. The boy Kareem's younger brother stood taller than before, his eyes no longer wide with fear but focused with purpose. He wore a black t-shirt with white block letters across the chest. "I don't flinch when I tell the truth." He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Maya placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You ready?" He nodded once. Always was. She handed him a spare radio and motioned to the broadcast panel. "If anything happens to me, you hit that button." Then she returned to the barracks and sat down beside her cot. The boots were laced. The flag was folded. She took out a rag and wiped her boots slowly, methodically, until the dust gave way to dull leather and worn stitching. It wasn't ritual. It was clarity. Above her desk, she pinned one sentence scrawled in thick marker on the back of a packing slip. "Fire doesn't scare what's already burned." When the sun rose, soft and orange against the horizon, it cast long shadows through the doorway. Birds stirred in the pines. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed, then faded. Maya's phone buzzed once. No name, no number. The message read, "They've put the rest of the list on the chopping block. You're the last one not crossed out." She stared at it for a moment. Then she turned off the phone and slipped it into her coat pocket. She stood, placed one hand to her chest, took a long breath, and exhaled slowly. Some people wake each day to live. Others wake to make the day matter. The message had been brief, the meaning razor-sharp. "You're the last one not crossed out." Maya felt no fear. Fear was for those who still thought they had something to lose. What Maya had now was something sharper resolve. It clung to her skin like the Georgia humidity, heavy and unmoving. She knew what tomorrow held, and if it was war, then let it be on record. At precisely 12:04 a.m., under the amber wash of a flickering floodlight, she pulled up to a desolate gas station off Highway 27. The place looked abandoned except for the smell of gasoline and the tired buzz of a soda machine. No cameras, no customers. Only a single black SUV was parked on the far side, engine off, windows tinted. From the passenger seat stepped Alexis Corporter, firebrand, daughter of immigrants, and one of the few left in the country who still cared about truth more than headlines. Maya stepped out of her vehicle without haste, her coat heavy with more than cloth. She walked toward Alexis and handed over the drive, small, black, and humming with the weight of hundreds of stolen futures. "You'll want to open this in private," Maya said quietly. "Use an offline machine. If it connects to a signal, it dies." Alexis took the drive, but her fingers trembled. "You're sure it's safe?" "No," Maya replied, "but it's real." They sat in the car, engine still off, parked under nothing but stars and tension. Alexis opened her laptop, disabled the Wi-Fi, and inserted the drive. What she saw widened her eyes like floodgates unsealed. A spreadsheet appeared: names, arrest dates, notes marked "no warrant," "no legal justification," and "processed under quota." Besides, some names were photos, blurred bruises, restrained bodies, tears dried on cheeks, and then she found them, the ones no one had dared speak of, former intelligence staffers, one congressional aide, two retired military intelligence officers. Names that had disappeared quietly now resurfaced on a list not meant to be read. "My God," Alexis whispered, hand to her mouth. "These people, some of them, worked on classified ops, and they were just erased?" Maya's voice was low, controlled. They were repurposed into silence. Alexis scrolled further, then she stopped. "This one, I know this man. He gave a keynote at a press freedom conference 5 years ago. Everyone thought he died in a car accident, but this file shows he was arrested 3 days before the crash." Maya looked out at the dark fields beyond the lot. Her voice dropped an octave, slower now. "We believed the system had cracks. It doesn't, it has channels. This isn't incompetence, it's design." Alexis said nothing, but her hand tightened around the steering wheel. Then she nodded. "I'll run it. I'll go dark until it's out." Maya gave her a small smile, sad, worn, but genuine. "That's all I can ask." But the night wasn't finished. 2 hours later, as Alexis drove home along a dim stretch of highway, her vehicle was hit from behind, hard. A black truck with no plates rammed her twice, the sound of metal folding in on itself like ribs crushed under pressure. Her car swerved into a ditch, the windows shattered by force and betrayal. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the red glow of a taillight fading into the dark. Maya received the news at dawn. Alexis was alive, but barely. The doctors said she was in a medically induced coma, her skull fractured, her ribs bruised, and one lung collapsed. They had moved her to a private wing under tight restrictions. Maya went to the hospital under a false name. She slipped into the role of distant cousin, dressed in plain clothes, voice soft, questions few. No one challenged her. The nurse on duty showed her the room, dimly lit, antiseptic, monitors blinking slowly above a still frame beneath white sheets. Maya stood there a long time, watching the rise and fall of Alexis's chest. Machines breathed for her now, but the drive she'd carried was safe duplicated, encrypted, stored, and yet something felt off. Maya asked for the chart. The nurse hesitated, but Maya's tone didn't allow for refusal. She scanned the file, flipping past blood work and vital signs until she reached the internal log. Her breath caught. A red-stamped line across the top read, "No unauthorized visitors, per internal directive." No badge number, no agency, just an internal directive. Her hands curled slowly into fists. This wasn't local anymore. This wasn't about precincts or patrol cars. This was the network, the deep corporate current beneath the waves of justice, a machine that didn't just erase people, it rewrote the rules after they vanished. And Maya knew. Alexis had been targeted not for what she published, but for what she had seen. That meant Maya was next, not as prey, but as proof. She stepped out into the hall, her boots echoing down the linoleum. The hospital smelled like bleach and inevitability. The weight of what she carried now was heavier than evidence. It was a legacy. Outside, the sun had begun to rise. Pale gold light slid through the blinds, slicing the corridor in two. She didn't stop walking, because she understood something that the men who sat in suits behind glass walls would never grasp. You can kill a story, you can bury a whistle, you can silence a scream, but you cannot unsee what has been seen, and you cannot erase the name of someone willing to speak it again. Justice doesn't always scream in daylight. Sometimes it waits, breathing quietly beside a hospital bed, watching for the moment when silence finally cracks. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of the hospital as Maya stepped onto the pavement, her boots steady on the concrete, her gaze lifted toward the horizon, not in hope, but in readiness. Her presence no longer belonged to the shadows. It belonged to the reckoning that comes after a lie has overstayed its silence. The moment was sharp, threaded with decision. She had stood at the edge of darkness long enough. The system had names, faces, voices. Now it would have consequences. Outside the clinic, near the entrance ramp, a boy stood alone. He couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13, with shoes too big for his frame and a stillness in his eyes that did not belong to children. He held something in his small, worn hands, bent at the corners. It was a photograph, faded, black and white. Kareem's face looked up at her from the image like a whisper frozen in time. "Are you Maya?" the boy asked, his voice low but steady. She nodded. "Who are you?" "I'm Malik," he replied. "Kareem was my cousin. I live with my grandma now." Maya crouched slightly, studying him. There was no fear in him, no trembling lip, just the kind of sadness that learns how to sit still, how to hold its breath. He extended the photo. His fingers didn't shake. "He told me," Malik said, "if anything ever happened to him, and if I saw your name on television, I should find you." I waited. Maya took the picture, turned it over. On the back, in Kareem's handwriting, was one line, "Not everything worth recording fits in a file." "What else did he give you?" she asked softly. Malik glanced around, cautious, then reached into the lining of his jacket. From a hidden fold, he pulled out a small audio recorder worn, taped at the edges, clearly handled more than once. Maya held her breath. She recognized the model. Old, analog, no cloud sync, no digital trail. The kind of recorder people used when they didn't trust memory or the law. They went to a corner table inside the clinic lobby, still early enough that no one paid attention. Maya inserted a fresh battery, pressed play. The tape hissed, then clicked. A man's voice filled the speaker. Not Kareem's. It was deeper, slower, confident in the way only power can afford to be. "I told them," the voice said, "we didn't need to justify a damn thing. Geo gets their numbers, we get the votes, and the streets get quieter. Everybody wins." A short pause, then laughter, cold, unfiltered. "They'll cry for a few days, then forget. These people, they don't have anyone left to protect them." Maya's hand curled into a fist, her jaw clenched so tightly her molars ached. She didn't recognize the voice immediately, but she recognized the tone, that practiced arrogance, that dismissive ease. The audio ended abruptly, the silence more damning than any words spoken. She stared at the recorder, her pulse steady but loud. Then she looked at Malik. "Did Kareem say who that was?" Malik nodded once. "He said the man used to work in the capital. He raised money for the prisons, said he had friends in uniforms, and on podiums." Maya placed her hand gently on Malik's shoulder. For a moment, she said nothing. Her mouth trembled slightly, but she held it together. She didn't cry. Kareem's legacy had already cost too much. It deserved strength now, not sorrow. "Your cousin was braver than most men I've known," she said. Malik shrugged slightly, but his voice cracked. "He said stories matter, even if nobody wants to hear them." Maya stood, pulled him close, arms wrapped around the small frame like armor. She felt the slight tremor in his breath, the way he held it in. She didn't tell him it would be okay. She didn't lie. Instead, she said, "You're safe now, and you gave me what I needed." She arranged for Malik to stay at an old barracks site she had repurposed, not far from Doc's location. The place had been converted into a shelter, but not just for rest. It was where survivors stayed while learning how to resist, though to speak, record, and stand. She introduced him to the others quietly, handed the caretaker a file with his name and Kareem's photo, then turned away without ceremony. Back in the truck, Maya held the recorder in her hand. Her reflection in the side mirror looked harder than before. Not older, just sharpened. The voice on the tape smug, secure, cloaked in political immunity, had made one fatal error. He believed no one was listening. Now Maya had more footage, more than signatures. She had a confession carved in sound, evidence of rot at the roots, from the very mouth of the men who fed on power and bartered away dignity like cheap currency. This wasn't about individual corruption anymore. This was systemic, institutional, and it had spoken out loud. Her phone lit up with a message from Doc. It read only 3 words: "All systems armed." She responded with one line: "Initiate broadcast prep." There would be no more waiting. The final card was now in her hand. She had the proof, the witness, the voice, and the fury. Justice was no longer an idea. It was loaded, and it was aimed. The boy in the blue shirt had handed her the match. Now it was time to strike. The voice on the recording had laughed when it said, "They don't have anyone left to protect them." But he had forgotten someone always listens long enough to remember. By the time the sun had set that evening, Maya had already mapped every route out of the city and back in again. The voice on the recorder still echoed in her head, not in sound, but in implication. They don't have anyone left to protect them. He was wrong. She was still standing. And now, she had a name. Carl Reacher. Publicly, he was a liaison officer director of communications between the state police and GEO Group. Privately, he was the switchboard through which every dirty wire connected. And tonight, he was going to meet the wrong person under the wrong assumption. Maya disguised herself as a contract negotiator using credentials pieced together from a real firm whose office had burned in a records fire 2 years ago. She sent a meeting request to Reacher's private channel, one only shared between GEO and its political financiers. The bait was simple, a new quota model proposal for a cross-state holding project. Bigger facilities, faster transfer times, and cleaner optics for high-volume processing. It was the kind of language people like Reacher salivated over. He accepted the meeting without hesitation. They met at a wine bar on the edge of Augustadam, upscale, secluded. Reacher arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a sharkskin suit and a crooked smirk. His handshake was moist, aggressive. His voice oozed condescension wrapped in fake charm. "You don't look like procurement," he said, eyeing Maya as he sat. She smiled coolly. "You don't look like someone who says no to money." He chuckled, ordered a glass of red, and began outlining his vision. Maya listened, nodding at the right moments, feeding his ego with well-timed flattery. The sedative she'd stirred into his wine was odorless, tasteless, something she'd learned to make during her time overseas. By the time the glass was half empty, his words were slurring, his posture slipping. Minutes later, Reacher blinked into a different kind of darkness. He woke to the cold breath of concrete beneath his cheek. A single overhead bulb swayed slightly, casting dizzying shadows across the walls. His wrists were zip-tied behind the back of a rusted metal chair. Across from him, Maya sat silently, elbows on her knees, her eyes steady and unreadable. "No badge?" he croaked. "No Miranda rights." She tilted her head. "You think you're owed due process? I know my rights. You traded other people's rights for bonuses. You don't get to quote the Constitution now." Reacher squirmed, tried to assess the room. The storage unit was unmarked, forgotten once part of a military depot, now reduced to rust and memory. There were no windows, no witnesses, and Maya had already disabled the GPS tracker in his Rolex. "I've been documenting your work for 6 months, she said evenly. "You've approved over 4,000 non-warrant detainments. 72 resulted in death. One of them was Kareem Brooks." He flinched at the name. It was subtle but not invisible. Maya leaned in. "You think the worst part is getting caught. It's not. The worst part is knowing your playbook's been memorized and rewritten." She didn't touch him, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she began describing to him, step by step, how isolation rewires the mind, how silence becomes torture, how the absence of a clock fractures the psyche faster than pain ever could. It wasn't a threat, it was a lesson. By hour 2, his breathing had changed. By hour 3, he spoke. He confessed that the quota system wasn't just tolerated, it was incentivized. Counties received kickbacks for every detainee that met GEO's behavioral risk model. Lawmakers voted based on jail population data, manipulated by the very agencies that profited from them. The incentive to over-police wasn't theoretical, it was spreadsheeted. And then he said it. "Danvers is getting an award next week. Homeland Security wants to recognize its reduction in urban incidents. But you and I both know how he got those numbers." Maya recorded everything: voice, tone, timestamps. The files were instantly uploaded via Signal Splitter to 3 secure backups. Carl slumped in the chair, sweat clinging to his collar. "I told you what you wanted. Now, let me go." Maya rose without a word. She walked behind him, sliced the zip ties with a flick of her blade, and placed a flash drive in his lap. "That's your insurance," she said. "1 copy of your confession. If I disappear, that copy becomes public. You're free to run." He looked up, confused. "That's it? You're not my target. You're a mirror. Now go look at yourself." As he staggered toward the door, he paused. He turned, eyes darker now, but calmer. "You think this ends with me," he said, "but you're not the only one they mark." Maya didn't blink. "I know. That's why I'm not stopping." The door slammed behind him, and for the first time that day, Maya allowed herself to sit, just for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from calculation. Reacher's final words weren't a warning, they were confirmed. She wasn't hunting ghosts, she was closing in on architects. This wasn't about retaliation anymore, it was about dismantling the entire structure. Because even the 4th one eventually leads to the first brick. Maya left Carl Reacher's confession humming through her veins like a sharpened blade and headed straight back to the reclaimed barracks with a singular purpose: to ignite something bigger than herself. She paced the dusty floor of the makeshift war room as dawn crept through broken windows, turning specks of debris into golden motes in silent motion. Today, she told herself, history would shift. With Doc's help, she produced her first campaign video, calm, compelling, and unrelenting. She recounted Kareem's story with brutal clarity, a young man who dared to record injustice, only to vanish into a dark system that devours the vulnerable. She showed clips, names, dates, proof that this was not a theory, it was happening. Then she made her call. If you've been stopped, detained, harmed, if you have stood alone in that silence, come forward now. Your voice matters. The release was careful but immediate. Within hours, dozens responded. Not tweets, not shares, but direct, urgent messages. Screenshots of arrest records marked "no warrant, citation unknown," and processed under quota. Torn, folded photographs of bruised faces, damaged mail, and boots pressed into dirt beside idling squad cars. Evidence from men and women veterans, government employees, community leaders, many, answering the question of what happens when people like them simply dare to exist. Among the replies were legal minds. A small band of civil rights lawyers who had followed her fight agreed to assist pro bono. They sought documents, affidavits, testimonies, anything to build cases. They would stand beside the victims while Maya stood at the front line. Word spread state to state. Reports streamed in from Arizona, New Mexico, and Michigan. Veterans who thought they'd left war behind found themselves redrafted into fights they never chose. A retired medic in Ohio sent pictures of police fingerprints beside her home. A former Marine in Texas reported being held overnight without charge, his PTSD treatment logs ignored entirely. All submitted paperwork, all ready to speak. Georgia was no longer alone. Maya transformed the old compound into a headquarters for the campaign. Tables were covered with maps, phones, laptops, and stacks of printed evidence. Charts tracked calls, leads, and potential prospects. A photo booth captured stories. Voices recorded and archived. This was no longer a one-woman mission, it was an uprising of the marginalized. Late afternoon, an older black man entered the compound. His uniform patch marked him as a veteran from 1969. His steps were slow but determined, his presence calm, presence shaped by history and resolve. He placed a folded letter on the folding table beneath a floodlight. Maya approached without hesitation. "I wore my uniform once, for America," he said softly. His voice carried experience, not bitterness, but weight. "Then I wore it again for myself. They stopped me in downtown Savannah because I walked like a veteran. They said I was causing a disturbance. I wasn't thinking. I just remembered who I was." He held up his service ID dog tags from Vietnam, a clean copy of his draft letter, a small stack of photos from 1969. Maya accepted them and placed his name beside Kareem's on a carved wooden post she had brought in for this moment. Under the afternoon sun, she lifted a chisel and etched Kareem Brooks in bold lettering. Beside it, the new name joined the line, Samuel Sam Rogers. Each stroke was deliberately a message that they would not disappear quietly. Each scrape against the wood was a victory against erasure. As the names grew, so did the sense of purpose. They were more than victims. They were evidence. That evening, Maya drafted a public letter addressed to Sheriff Danvers and the entire state council. It read, "I am coming, not to negotiate, not to debate, to read the names you ignored, the stories you erased, and the truths you signed away. I will wait for you where the laws are written." The envelope, stamped but unrouted, waited by the phone. The next morning, cameras rolled as she posted the final campaign video. Hundreds gathered online, tens in person, eyes fixed on that wooden post in the courtyard. Each name carved on it was a living story, not a statistic. When the camera shifted back to Maya, her voice was steady, unyielding. "This is not just Georgia's reckoning. It's the nation's. We tell the truth, so history won't repeat itself. We demand a reckoning for those who erased our names." Within hours, the media ignited. Social feeds flooded with number voices carved. Hashtags, articles, and silent hashtags are visited across platforms. Calls to Danvers began, not just from reporters, but from groups who had been ignored until now. Local pastors, school teachers, librarians. Their message was simple. Where is the meeting? Who will stand with us as witnesses? That afternoon, Danvers himself appeared on local news. His posture was stiff, rehearsed. His voice was flat and rehearsed, syrupy with denial. Sheriff Danvers, we do not negotiate with extremists or terrorists claiming to fight for a cause. These demonstrations are coordinated acts aimed at undermining law enforcement. We have not authorized any unlawful detentions. His words hit the air like ice, but they rang hollow. The evidence hung in the headlines. The carved names held their weight, and the response grew not in volume, but in resolve. Maya watched the broadcast from the courtyard. She stood beside the carved pillar, hand resting on Kareem's name. The wood was smooth under her palm, warm with history and gravity. She didn't cheer. She only breathed, slowly, deeply, a soldier returning from the front, not to celebrate victory, but to steady herself for what comes next. Because once a call is made in the darkness, and an army answers not with guns, but with truth, it doesn't matter how cold the night gets. They will stand. Justice doesn't whisper. It gathers. It echoes. And in its gathering, it becomes unmissable. The ground beneath Maya's boots still trembled with the last cry of the crowd from the night before, and though dawn had barely torn open the sky, she already stood tall in its bruising light. This was no longer a battle for evidence or a plea for attention. This was the reckoning. Her body ached, her scars no longer just reminders but roadmaps to the summit of this one inevitable moment, the moment when silence would no longer serve. She zipped up her black jacket, pulled on the faded gray t-shirt underneath, and stared down at the single word printed across her chest: Kareem. By the time Maya approached the marble steps of the Georgia State Capitol, the square was already overflowing. Hundreds had gathered, veterans in old uniforms, survivors in church clothes, teenagers with homemade signs inked in righteous fury. Cameras lined the perimeter like sentries. Journalists from every major coast had flown in, dragged by the gravitational pull of something even they couldn't spin. Some hoped for spectacle. Others, perhaps, sought atonement. Maya moved through them like gravity incarnate, head high, every step deliberate. She had no security, no script, just 3 terabytes of truth in her bag, and a name on her chest that still made the system flinch. Her voice cut through the swell of murmurs like a strike of lightning through smoke. I am Maya Jennings. I am a veteran. I am a witness, and I am not afraid. Her team began the live stream with triple redundancy. Every frame was secured, every word backed by hard data. She began not with accusations but with questions. Who decided which veterans were dangerous? Who calculated a quota like a sales metric? Who signed contracts that commodified captivity? She played the first recording, the voice of a state senator, arrogant and syrupy, laughing as he said, "They don't have anyone protecting them anyway." Maya followed with the document-scanned contracts between GO Group, local precincts, and state financial boards, spreadsheets showing arrest trends tied to funding cycles, images of bruises, names carved on wood, and finally, the audio that no denial could bury. Danvers instructing his deputies to meet minimum extraction numbers before quarterly reviews. The crowd grew still. Cameras zoomed. Screens flickered across living rooms nationwide. In that silence, truth did what it always does when it's sharp enough. Cut. Danvers arrived like a wolf, cornered in velvet. He didn't walk, he stormed. Flanked by 2 aides and a legal advisor, he attempted composure, his voice over the PA system smug and seething. This is an act of coordinated misinformation. We have procedures, protocols. Anyone claiming otherwise is complicit in disinformation or worse. He turned, signaling to cut the feed. But before his order landed, 2 agents in Navy windbreakers moved forward. FBI. The seal gleamed against their chests, their presence unmistakable. One stepped past the podium and handed Maya a document. The other approached Danvers, spoke 5 words into his ear, his face drained. Alexis Cho emerged from the side stairs, thin but standing, defiant, her left arm in a sling but her stare razor-sharp. She handed the agents a separate set of documents, federal arrest warrants. Her voice, amplified by the press mic, rang clear. These men are under investigation for conspiracy, unlawful detention, and tampering with federal oversight records. Danvers barked, "This is political theater." The agent beside him replied coldly, "Then enjoy your standing ovation." The metal cuffs clicked with finality. Not just Danvers, but 3 other collaborators, each pale, sweat-slick, stunned. One tried to protest, citing his service. Maya looked him in the eye. "You wore a badge, not a conscience." As the arrests unfolded in full view of every camera, Maya stepped back. She didn't gloat. She didn't weep. She simply breathed. For the first time since Kareem's name was spoken into a camera lens, her shoulders uncoiled. She turned slowly, eyes drawn past the crowd, to the wooden pillars still planted in the square's corner. Kareem, Sam, Roy, Malik's brother, so many others. And above them, carved just that morning, the words, "Justice doesn't wait for permission." The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but clarity. A wave of unified voice broke the air like thunder rolling off the hills. Justice for all. It started near the front, from the old man in the Vietnam fatigues, then spread through the young, the broken, the angry, the brave. Justice for all. It carried into the streets. It crossed cameras. It trended, then transcended. Maya stayed silent, just one hand raised to her chest, fingertips resting above the heart. She never once surrendered. Her face held a small, quiet smile, not of triumph, but of arrival. The road forward would be hard, she knew that. But this moment wasn't about what came next. It was about what would never be buried again. And as the sun climbed higher over the dome of the Capitol, Maya stood unmoved while the chant roared louder. Not for her. For every name not carved in stone but remembered in voice, justice had a face. And finally, the world saw it. The chant still echoed in Maya's bones as the crowd slowly dissolved, leaving behind a silence thick with revelation and a sky cracking into noon. But even as the handcuffs clinked shut on Danvers and the truth stood like flame in the center of the square, Maya knew this was only the spark, not the fire. Giants didn't fall with one blow. They collapsed in fragments, loud and slow, and were seen by all. By midweek, Geo Group had lost $1.2 billion in stock value. Investors scattered like rats in daylight, while talking heads on every financial channel stuttered through disclaimers, trying to reframe what could no longer be rewritten. The board issued a trembling statement, denying knowledge, promising audits, and suspending contracts. It didn't matter. The world had seen. The Georgia Attorney General announced a sweeping investigation at both the state and federal levels. DOJ task forces deployed quietly, but with surgical intent. Office doors that had stood unchallenged for decades were now being pried open, files extracted, hard drives cloned, and accounts frozen. The chain of command began to fray, then unravel. One by one, those who thought they were insulated found themselves subpoenaed, their names scrolling across chyrons in red. Then came the list, the full, uncensored, unredacted list, leaked online by an unknown whistleblower. The file labeled X Special surfaced like a hand from a grave. It named every individual tagged for silent removal, from Kareem to Roy, from truck drivers to teachers, from Vietnam vets to Iraq survivors. 87 families recognized names they thought had simply vanished. Those families did not go to candlelight vigils. They went to court. A coalition of attorneys launched the largest civil suit in Georgia's history. Some called it a reckoning. Others, reparations. For Maya, it was overdue. She attended no hearings, made no public comment. When a national newspaper asked for her first sit-down interview, she responded with a single line, "I'm not the story, they are." Still, the world couldn't help but look. One headline read, "Firewall Woman, the veteran who burned down a machine." Another called her the Quiet Storm. Television anchors debated her motives. Was she radical, heroic, dangerous? But across diner counters and barber shops, libraries and laundromats, a different conversation stirred. People asked each other why it took so long. Why did no one speak up sooner? Why only after one woman said enough did the whole damn structure start to shake? A prominent state senator stepped to a podium 3 days later, his hands visibly trembling. "I can no longer serve in a body that allowed this to happen under our noses. I resign today, effective immediately." No apology, no confession, just a void where power used to be. And then, almost missed among the chaos, someone cleaning out Kareem's small apartment found a note taped behind a photograph, yellowed, bent, but unmistakably his handwriting. It read, "If one person stays silent, evil wins. But if one person stands up, we all can." Maya read it twice, then again. Her hands didn't shake, but something behind her eyes did. She sat in her quiet bunker late that night, the walls humming with the muted noise of a world slowly awakening. There was no sleep. There hadn't been for days. The air felt heavy with aftermath, but also with possibility. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt ready. Her email dinged 1C. Simple, unmarked message. Subject, center offer body. There's an old military compound in South Dakota. Abandoned. Clean lines of sight. Former barracks. Intact comms. Bunker. You'd like it. You want it? No name, no signature. But Maya smiled. It was time to stop hiding the fire. Maybe it was time to train others how to carry it. She closed her laptop slowly, stood up, and walked out into the night. No spotlight followed, no anthem played. But somewhere in the air, in the still-breathing dark, it was clear giants had fallen, and she had never needed to shout to make the world listen. She didn't respond to the email with words. She never needed many to begin with. Instead, Maya arrived at the abandoned military compound 2 days later, dust trailing behind her like the last remnants of war being left on the road. The gate creaked, the barracks sagged, and the wind bit through cracks in the cinderblock walls. But standing in the middle of that vast emptiness, she saw something no one else had yet, the start of something that would not just resist, but rebuild. The end of the old was now giving birth to the beginning of the necessary. By the following month, a freshly carved wooden sign hung high over the restored main hall. Firewall Center. No insignia, no flags. Just that name, burned in clean, defiant strokes. Inside, walls were repainted, bunks refitted into desks, mess halls transformed into classrooms, and the old war room converted into a digital defense lab. The ghosts of old training drills gave way to the voices of new purpose. 17 students stood on the gravel lot the first morning. They ranged from 13 to 60 years old, different towns, different scars, but all had come for the same reason. They were tired of waiting for the world to be fair. Malik, just barely shoulder-high to Maya, wore a worn-out hoodie that once belonged to Kareem and stood at attention as if the gravel beneath his feet were sacred ground. Maya didn't give a speech. She handed each of them a small laminated card instead, printed with two things: the name of a person wrongfully detained and one clause of civil law. The cards would change weekly, but the memory? That had to remain permanent. Today, she finally said, her voice low and even, we learn what was never meant for us to know. Tomorrow, we teach it. One of the first classes bore the blunt title, How to Survive a Traffic Stop. No hypotheticals, no soft edges. The room was dimmed, sirens played on a loop, and a real squad coordinated anonymously by a retired officer was brought inside for simulation. They practiced voice tone, hand placement, and camera activation. They studied body language and badge numbers like soldiers once studied terrain and enemy posture, because for them, survival was tactical. The next day's lesson, what to say when they say you can't speak. It was Maya's favorite. She led the drills herself, correcting posture, instructing diction. Fear has a voice, she told them, and silence has weight, but law has volume. Learn to use it like armor. Along the back wall of the training room, Maya installed a gallery, not of medals, of loss. A solemn line of black and white portraits, each mounted with a date, a location, and one word: missing, killed, forgotten, silenced. She placed Kareem's photo at the center, not out of favoritism, but because his image had become their compass. The boy who filmed the truth when no one else dared. The voice that didn't tremble until it stopped. Veterans began to arrive by the week. They didn't come for healing. They came to fight in a different kind of war, kind that used words instead of weapons. Some taught constitutional rights, others demonstrated evasive strategy, some led mental resilience workshops drawn from years surviving combat and returning to find injustice at home. They weren't rebuilding warriors. They were raising defenders. A mother came one morning, clutching her son's hand like a shield. She said nothing at first, then finally looked Maya in the eye. I want him to learn how to walk tall, how not to bow his head just because someone tells him to. Maya nodded. No applause, no posters. But another name would soon go up on the wall. this time for the living. Malik Spile ETT. Late that week, as dusk cut golden shadows across the gravel and laughter rang out from the once silent halls, one of the older students approached Maya. He had been quiet until now, tall, serious, the kind who had seen things and didn't say much. But today, his voice didn't shake. "Miss Jennings," he asked, "what if they come back?" She didn't hesitate. Her eyes, steel and ember, didn't flinch. "Then this time," she said, "we'll be the ones knocking first." Outside, the sign above the center creaked once in the wind, as if nodding in agreement, and somewhere far off, those still hiding behind lawless shadows felt the ground shift slightly beneath their feet. The wind carried the memory of her words across the gravel, but far from Georgia, someone else had been listening. Maya received the letter 3 days after the center opened its doors. No return address, no insignia, just a heavy, ivory envelope marked with her name in a hand that didn't shake. Inside, a first-class train ticket to Washington, D.C., and a message typed clean and without pretense. "Let's talk about your future. Dr." She didn't need to Google the initials. Senator Douglas Reardon had never needed an introduction. He'd sat on the Homeland Appropriations Committee since before Kareem was born, and if there was a devil still dressing in tailored suits, it was him. She boarded the train with no fanfare, just her duffel bag and the weight of instinct pressing on her chest. The halls of Union Station greeted her with polished lies. Cameras rolled above her like unseen judges, and when the black SUV pulled to the curb, she climbed in without hesitation. His office on Capitol Hill didn't pretend to be modest. Floor-to-ceiling windows, mahogany desk. An old dusty American flag was folded into a triangle behind glass. It wasn't honor-preserved, it was camouflage. He stood when she entered, sharp in a gray suit that reeked of money and moral rot. "Miss Jennings," he said smoothly, offering a hand she didn't take. "Thank you for coming." She didn't sit. Reardon stepped behind his desk, but not before glancing to the corner, where a security camera blinked red. He waved his hand once. It clicked off. "You've done something impressive," he began. Each word laid down like a brick in a trap, pulled a narrative out of chaos. "You're articulate, commanding, and public opinion is a resource, Miss Jennings. One we could use more wisely." Her silence was a blade. He pressed on. "There's a subcommittee opening soon, advisory role, homeland and civil stability. Not ceremonial, real funding, real authority. All I ask is that you consider helping the future instead of punishing the past." She raised an eyebrow. "Future?" Reardon smiled. It didn't touch his eyes. "You know the geo matter can spiral. It already has. Stocks crashing, lawsuits multiplying, reputations burning." He leaned forward. "You could choose silence now. Let it end here. In exchange, we elevate you, give you tools, let you protect people within the system." Her eyes didn't blink. "You want me to muzzle the truth for a seat at the table," she said, not asking. He shrugged, amused. Every idealist hits the moment where outrage meets opportunity. Everyone has a price. "What's yours?" Maya turned. She didn't offer him the dignity of a farewell. Outside, her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. The text was just 4 words. They burned it down. She didn't run. She didn't shout. But the chill that ran through her ribcage was the kind forged in war zones, not in DC conference rooms. She booked the fastest route back, didn't sleep, and arrived as the sun began its retreat behind the pines of Georgia. Smoke curled from the ground like ghosts. The firewall center was gone. The barracks, the training hall, the mess room, the gallery, wall reduced to cinders and memory. Only the iron bolts in the foundation still held. And in front of them, cross-legged on the ground, was Malik. His eyes were red, his cheeks stained with tears that dried before they fell. He held the laminated card Maya had given him on day 1, Kareem's name, Clause 12B of the Civil Rights Act, unburnt. She knelt beside him, arms slow, steady. "Did you see who?" He shook his head, silent. Her chest didn't rise. It braced. Around them, the ashes whispered what couldn't be silenced. She looked past the rubble, past the sting of betrayal, past the false invitation in Reardon's suit-lined voice. Then she whispered to the boy, to herself, and the ghosts overhead. "They didn't burn our future, they just burned wood." Ash still clung to Maya's sleeves as she lifted Malik off the scorched steps, the morning's wind curling the smoke upward like unanswered prayers. Behind her, the firewall sig now nothing more than blackened timber still clung stubbornly to the one bolt that hadn't melted. She didn't mourn the wood. She mourned the pause in momentum, the blow meant to silence, not the center, but the meaning it carried. But some things, she thought, don't go down just because someone lit a match. You can't burn purpose. 3 days later, beneath the overcast hush of a Georgia noon, the ground where the center had once stood came alive again, not with construction crews or media vans, but with people, all kinds, wrinkled hands that once saluted on foreign soil, calloused palms that once held protest signs. Small fingers were clutched by their mothers, veterans, teachers, youth who had never spoken but always listened. They came without speeches, without microphones, without flags or chants, only presence, only breathe, only resolve. Maya stood in the heart of the dirt lot and lifted the new sign, stenciled by hand, bolted by volunteers. Firewall, carved with deeper grooves, deeper knowing. At its base, they had raised again the cedar column, the one bearing Kareem's name. She ran her hand along the grain. Someone had left a dog tag nailed just below his name. No one admitted to it. Everyone understood it. There was no stage, only a cinder block, stacked on a cinder block. She stepped up, slowly, scanning the gathering with that same calm gaze that once froze gunmen mid-trigger. She held no paper. She didn't need one. Every word had already been burned into her marrow. She reached into a canvas folder, pulled out a roll of yellowed paper, the same list they'd uncovered in that GO compound months ago, the deletion roster. She unrolled it like scripture. Names faded, some nearly illegible from smoke stains, but she didn't falter. She read each name aloud, one by one, clear, even, unbroken. For the first time, no one clapped. There was no applause. Only the wind passed through the assembly like something reverent. Each name, a weight. Each syllable, a marker of someone who had been meant to vanish quietly. Now they were spoken into the daylight. Then came the envelopes, handed to each person who stood in the crowd. Folded inside, a single page. On one side, a paragraph explaining their rights. On the other hand, their responsibilities, what to do when silence tries to swallow truth again. Maya didn't sign the pages. Truth didn't need her name, it needed their eyes. Malik stepped forward, not pushed, not prompted. The youngest in the crowd, yet already weathered. The blue hoodie now faded with ash, Kareem's old camera strap around his neck. His voice, though young, did not shake. My brother pressed record when others looked away. He wanted to show what was hidden, but he never got to finish. I want to finish it. Not a dry eye. Not even the oldest. Not even the most hardened. After that, something began. It wasn't loud. It wasn't planned. One by one, people stepped forward. A teacher who had been suspended for calling out bias. A veteran who once believed in the system until it forgot him. A mother who said the word fear was not meant to live in her child's breath. Each of them said nothing flashy. Only truth. Only experience. Only their place in the ledger. And when it was Maya's turn again, she didn't climb the cinder block. She simply stood, hands behind her back, shoulders squared. The voice of someone who had walked too long to pretend now was the finish line. No one here is the hero. No one person is justice. But each of us, she said slowly, letting her gaze hold every pair of eyes, can be one vertebra in its spine. She raised her hand and pointed not to a building, not to a flag, but to the people in front of her. You are what stands between silence and surrender. And then, only then, did she turn to the one camera Malik had set up on a broken tripod. A live stream, once again, but not to confront power this time, to call something greater. Maya leaned forward. Her voice was steel wrapped in velvet. I'm not asking you to join me. I'm asking you to see me. If you're waiting for a permission slip to stand up, this is it. If you've been told your story doesn't matter, tell it louder. And if you're wondering whether it's time, she paused, breath controlled, eyes blazing. Then let me ask, who will be the one to stand next? The feed didn't cut, the sound didn't fade, the frame stayed on her face. No slogans, no editing, only truth, waiting for an answer. The silence stretched long after her figure disappeared into the haze. Malik remained, the weight of the hammer no longer foreign in his grip, as if the echoes of all that came before had settled into his bones. Around him, the remnants of ash clung to everything: shirts, skin, the ribs of collapsed wall sand, yet he stood like something just beginning, not something ending. Above, the sky bore down without pity, the kind of heavy gray that didn't mourn but remembered. He adjusted the board on the last beam, still upright, its splinters biting his palms like pennants. Beneath his feet, the soil was thick with history, and every step made it harder to forget what had been taken and what had been built in defiance of that theft. Somewhere behind the perimeter line, a group of onlookers gathered, not many, but enough for murmurs to spread, and among them were those who had turned away when Maya screamed in the courtroom, who had written letters to suspend her license when she dared speak against the mayor's curfew law. One of them, a former councilman named Troy Bellamy, stood apart from the crowd, sunglasses failing to hide the bruise on his cheekbone, a relic from the night protesters surrounded his SUV, and demanded he explain why his vote gutted the housing bill. His silence then had cost him more than a C-addict had stripped him of the illusion that neutrality was anything but complicity. Earlier that morning, someone had spray-painted the words, "Speak or Step Down," across his garage in red paint, so thick it bled down the pavement like truth refusing to stay clean. Still, he came, not for Maya or Malik, but for the possibility that standing there might redeem a fragment of what he had lost in boardrooms and back doors. Down the hill, near the remains of what used to be the library, a boy named Isaiah had drawn a circle in the dust with the toe of his sneaker. He was 10, but already knew how to catalog the faces that watched him with suspicion: shopkeepers, crossing guards, even a teacher who once reported his backpack as too heavy for a child who claimed innocence. His sister had cried for hours. When the district banned the after-school program, Maya had created one that gave kids like them somewhere to go when the streets began to whisper danger. That ban came with a slick press release and a quote from Superintendent Clarendon, who insisted it was for resource reallocation. Clarendon wasn't in the crowd. He hadn't been seen since the recording leaked him laughing over cocktails with a lobbyist, mocking Maya's voice as too sharp, too black, too brave. The clip had gone viral in 3 hours. The school district's server crashed under the weight of shame and fury, and for once, the silence wasn't protection, it was exposure. Across from the fence, at the old train depot, a woman in a mustard coat was being heckled. Her name was Judge Lillian Reeves, once hailed as the conscience of Jefferson County, until her ruling overturned the investigation into the detention center fire that killed 4 teenagers, 3 of whom had only been held because they missed court dates they were never informed of. Lillian had called it a tragedy, but unavoidable. That word had followed her like smoke. It curled into conversations, courtrooms, and headlines. A month ago, protesters had chased her down the courthouse steps. Someone threw a shoe. Someone else spat. She didn't fall, but she flinched, and the video of that flinch said more than her 20 years on the bench ever did. Now, she stood alone, pretending not to notice that her driver had abandoned the car after a flat tire and that no one from her office had answered her texts in days. Even her nameplate had been scraped off the courtroom door by whom no one admitted, but no one repaired it either. Closer to Malik, a whisper Rosione, not from the crowd but the wind itself, catching on the raw corners of the board he had mounted. The charcoal still smelled like truth, and Malik traced a finger over the final word Maya had carved before dawn. He had watched her do it, her hands trembling not from fear but from restraint. Her voice had been gone since the night they burned the clinic, not because of smoke, but because she had spent 6 hours talking to each family that lost someone in the fire. She gave every word she had to others, so there was nothing left for herself, and so, instead of speaking, she carved. And when the carving was done, she pressed her handprint beside it, not to claim it, but to surrender Ito, the boy who had watched her build something in a town determined to erase her. From the far side of the lot, a figure stumbled forward, coughing. It was Ethan Maddox, the former police captain, whose body cam had been turned off the night Maya's brother was arrested and never came home. For years, he had smirked through hearings, pointed to statistics, and deflected outrage. But last week, someone published the Auditon internal report buried for 5 years, which showed he authorized transfers of underage detainees without proper oversight. Overnight, Ethan's name trended not with medals but with grave markers. His neighbor neighbors stopped waving. His gym canceled his membership for safety concerns. His daughter's college rescinded his scholarship endowment. The town he once patrolled now looked through him, not at him. And when he approached the wooden board Malik had just nailed in place, no one moved to make space. He stood outside the circle, irrelevant. Malik finished tightening the last nail. The sound it made a clean puncture, followed by a brief quiver hung in the air like a note held too long. Around him, the crowd wasn't applauding. They weren't chanting. They weren't filming for clout. They were simply witnessing, not performance, not a protest, presence. Each breath they took confirmed something had shifted. Not enough to undo what had been done, but just enough to make space for what might come next. Malik stepped back and looked at the board one final time. One word burned into it: firewall. Beneath it, smeared in charcoal and truth, a single sentence: not to fight fire, but to stop it from burning what remains human. There was no line of cameras perched on tripods, no mayor in a suit rehearsing sound bites, no child conscripted to snip a ribbon while adults clapped for something they never bled to build. Instead, there was sawdust clinging to calloused palms, rust flaking off a beam that had once held up a condemned school gym, and the dry grind of effort echoing beneath a patched metal roof. The center didn't rise in defiance of neglect, it grew through it, like moss through cracks, slow but certain. The blueprints were scrawled in the margins of eviction notices and the backside corners of food pantry receipts. The foundation was leveled using borrowed shovels and a wheelbarrow with a cracked tire. No permit had been issued, and no one came to stop them, not because the city approved, but because the city had already turned its back. They were building in the blind spot of bureaucracy, and that gave them time just enough to finish what had been started. The windows, what remained of them, were fitted with mesh screens instead of glass, a lesson learned from last summer when bricks had shattered the front of the wellness co-op under the cover of night. The official statement called it a random act of vandalism, but everyone knew it wasn't random. The man who'd thrown the first rock, Lars Benton, a former deputy turned bar owner, had posted just hours before. Places like that make neighborhoods soft. He had laughed when the footage surfaced. His laugh had the jagged shape of confidence born from impunity. But 2 days later, a group of mothers, none of them armed, stood in silence outside his bar. They wore shirts with the names of every child who had spent time in that co-op's crisis room. No slogans, no shouting, just presence. For 11 nights, they returned, saying nothing. His bar emptied. His liquor distributor canceled the contract. His landlord raised the rent. Lars left town before the 12th night. Inside the center, they had rewired the generator by hand. Kareem's old laptop sat tethered by a frayed cord, still booting slower than memory, but still booting. On the wall above it, someone had taped the last photo taken before the school board meeting imploded. Maya, eyes locked on Councilwoman Riggs, who had sneered, "This town doesn't need a sanctuary for delinquents." The recording caught the pause, the room shifting like a held breath, and then Maya's reply, "You're mistaking broken systems for broken people." That phrase spread, etched on locker doors, carved into park benches, but Riggs, who once hosted donor brunches beneath portraits of her grandfather, himself a segregationist judge, found herself increasingly alone. Parent Alliance, she led, fractured, after the superintendent admitted Riggs had pushed to rezone 3 neighborhoods to limit minority enrollment. Her staff resigned. Her husband filed for separation. The local paper unearthed old text gold, clipped instructions to remove bilingual signage, and cut funding for any program with equity in the title. She denied nothing. "People are too emotional," she said on live radio, but no one was listening by then. Her mic was still on, but her voice no longer landed. In the north hallway of the center, remnants of riot shields had been repurposed into shelvish holding books, not batons. They were bolted beside a mural of Aaliyah Jones, painted in muted greens and stormy violets. Aaliyah, who'd once taught poetry in the abandoned lot next to the freeway, had been shoved to the ground during a routine sweep the night the curfew was enacted. The officer, Miles Harkey, claimed she had reached into her bag too quickly. He had not known she was carrying notebooks, not weapons. Her injuries weren't fatal, but the silence that followed nearly was. For weeks, not one city official spoke her name. But then the footage surfaced, slow motion, grainy, undeniable. Harkey was placed on administrative leave. The mayor called it an unfortunate lapse in judgment, but judgment shifted. Students at Eastview High wore tape over their mouths and wrote her name across their arms in permanent marker. Her face was was projected onto the side of City Hall with a quote, "They don't want us silent. They want us gone." Harkey filed a defamation suit. He lost. The judge cited the video. The department refused to reinstate him. No precinct in the county would touch him after that. He now delivered food in a borrowed truck, and when he approached houses in that same neighborhood, doors closed before he reached the step. Back in the main atrium, Malik climbed the scaffolding with the speaker in hand. He had found it in the back of Kareem's truck, next to an old duffel of circuit boards and a spool of Ethernet cable that no one remembered wiring. It still worked. He mounted it to the rafter with a belt and whispered a prayer not meant for words. Outside, the chalk outlines began to grow, drawn not by coroners but children. Instead of silhouettes of loss, they traced shapes of what they dreamed to become. One a firefighter, another a pilot, one with wings too wide for the concrete to contain. Malik stood beneath the rig, breathing slowly, then hit play. The sound crackled to life. Kareem's voice, uneven but resolute. "Justice doesn't have a shape, it only has memory." The words poured out like oil over flame, slow and hot and impossible to ignore. The crowd went still. Even the wind quieted. And in that moment, every corner of the center felt sentient, like the beams could hear, like the rafters held their breath. And as the message faded, the stillness wasn't hollow, it was charged. Malik stepped back down and walked toward the entry gates, where the last wall of the courtyard remained unfinished. There, veterans lined up shoulder to shoulder, measuring distance between studs using twine and instinct. Some had once diffused IEDs with trembling fingers. Others had returned from deployments to find foreclosure notices stapled to their childhood homes. They knew what it meant to build from ruin. Nearby, mothers waited with coolers, handing out bottles of water, passing folded towels to kids with sweat on their necks. One mother, whose daughter had been expelled for recording a teacher's racist outburst, now handed out notebooks with her child's name embossed on the cover. Another, whose son had disappeared for 5 hours in a transport glitch after being detained without cause, pressed her palm gently to the shoulder of a boy who flinched when sirens passed. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Veterans built training rigs out of scrap. Mothers stood at the gates handing out water and wisdom. The sun leaned low over the rust-stained hills, casting long shadows from the broken gravestones behind the church, where names had been weathered away and faith had outlived architecture. Maya's hands, thick with earth, moved slowly through the clay, turning, loosening, folding it over itself like memory kneaded into permanence. Her sleeves were rolled above the elbow, revealing a lattice of healed scars that no longer asked for sympathy. The ground here hadn't grown anything in years, not since the last drought, but she kept working it anyway, not for harvest, but for rhythm. Her boots pressed deeper with every motion, grounding her in something older than systems, older than even truth. The shovel's worn handle creaked in her grip as the dry soil yielded inch by inch, giving way not to seeds, but to silence that had purpose. The woman stood watching her for a long while. Her uniform bore no insignia now, only faint stitching where emblems had been removed, stripped, not by decree, but by choice. She had left rank behind 2 months ago, walked out of a briefing where the words collateral containment had been used to describe a school gymnasium. That recording, leaked by an unnamed analyst, had ignited a brief, brutal firestorm. For 48 hours, it consumed screens across the nation. A voice flat, male-controlled said, "You'll get 40% casualties. Acceptable if we neutralize the rhetorical centers." One clip, 14 seconds, enough to melt a dozen careers, but none of the men who said it faced charges. They held press conferences instead, denied nothing, admitted nothing. One offered a resigned sigh and said, "History will sort it out." His resignation letter was framed in the new defense lobby's headquarters a week later. His name, Brent Maddox, still trended every few days, mostly alongside the word coward. The woman's voice cracked slightly as she spoke again. "They told us you went off-grid, said you lost perspective." Her eyes drifted across the church, where bullet holes had been patched with rusted tin and prayers in Spanish were still scratched into the siding with keys. One read, "Protege los que ya no pueden correr." Protect those who can no longer run. Maya didn't answer. Her hands moved again, steady as breath. The dirt clung to her fingers like it recognized her. In the distance, a car backfired, startling a cluster of birds into flight from a skeletal tree. The woman flinched. She still had reflexes tuned to sound, to threat, to aftermath, but she no longer reached for a weapon. She hadn't touched one since they shut down Project Cormorant. After the final debrief, her supervisor handed her a coin-sized chip and said, "No future psychological viability." It was supposed to be a quiet dismissal, but the note ended up in Appendix C of the final report. And that note, like all digital truths, found its way into public hands. Within hours, the story broke. The backlash was swift, sharp, but fleeting. People called it dystopian for a few days, then moved on. But the fallout was quieter elsewhere. In one state, a memorial wall was spray-painted with the phrase, "No future viability" beside. The silence stretched long after her figure disappeared into the haze. Malik remained, the weight of the hammer no longer foreign in his grip, as if the echoes of all that came before had settled into his bones. Around him, the remnants of ash clung to everything: shirts, skin, the ribs of collapsed wall sand, yet he stood like something just beginning, not something ending. Above, the sky bore down without pity, the kind of heavy gray that didn't mourn but remembered. He adjusted the board on the last beam, still upright, its splinters biting his palms like pennants. Beneath his feet, the soil was thick with history, and every step made it harder to forget what had been taken and what had been built in defiance of that theft. Somewhere behind the perimeter line, a group of onlookers gathered, not many, but enough for murmurs to spread, and among them were those who had turned away when Maya screamed in the courtroom, who had written letters to suspend her license when she dared speak against the mayor's curfew law. One of them, a former councilman named Troy Bellamy, stood apart from the crowd, sunglasses failing to hide the bruise on his cheekbone, a relic from the night protesters surrounded his SUV, and demanded he explain why his vote gutted the housing bill. His silence then had cost him more than a C addict had stripped him of the illusion that neutrality was anything but complicity. Earlier that morning, someone had spray-painted the words, "Speak or Step Down," across his garage in red paint, so thick it bled down the pavement like truth refusing to stay clean. Still, he came, not for Maya or Malik, but for the possibility that standing there might redeem a fragment of what he had lost in boardrooms and back doors. Down the hill, near the remains of what used to be the library, a boy named Isaiah had drawn a circle in the dust with the toe of his sneaker. He was 10, but already knew how to catalog the faces that watched him with suspicion: shopkeepers, crossing guards, even a teacher who once reported his backpack as too heavy for a child who claimed innocence. His sister had cried for hours. When the district banned the after-school program, Maya had created one that gave kids like them somewhere to go when the streets began to whisper danger. That ban came with a slick press release and a quote from Superintendent Clarendon, who insisted it was for resource reallocation. Clarendon wasn't in the crowd. He hadn't been seen since the recording leaked him laughing over cocktails with a lobbyist, mocking Maya's voice as too sharp, too black, too brave. The clip had gone viral in 3 hours. The school district server crashed under the weight of shame and fury, and for once, the silence wasn't protection, it was exposure. Across from the fence, at the old train depot, a woman in a mustard coat was being heckled. Her name was Judge Lillian Reeves, once hailed as the conscience of Jefferson County, until her ruling overturned the investigation into the detention center fire that killed 4 teenagers, 3 of whom had only been held because they missed court dates they were never informed of. Lillian had called it a tragedy, but unavoidable. That word had followed her like smoke. It curled into conversations, courtrooms, and headlines. A month ago, protesters had chased her down the courthouse steps. Someone threw a shoe. Someone else spat. She didn't fall, but she flinched, and the video of that flinch said more than her 20 years on the bench ever did. Now, she stood alone, pretending not to notice that her driver had abandoned the car after a flat tire and that no one from her office had answered her texts in days. Even her nameplate had been scraped off the courtroom door by whom no one admitted, but no one repaired it either. Closer to Malik, a whisper Rosione, not from the crowd but the wind itself, catching on the raw corners of the board he had mounted. The charcoal still smelled like truth, and Malik traced a finger over the final word Maya Maya had carved before dawn. He had watched her do it, her hands trembling not from fear but from restraint. Her voice had been gone since the night they burned the clinic, not because of smoke, but because she had spent 6 hours talking to each family that lost someone in the fire. She gave every word she had to others, so there was nothing left for herself, and so, instead of speaking, she carved. And when the carving was done, she pressed her handprint beside it, not to claim it, but to surrender Ito, the boy who had watched her build something in a town determined to erase her. From the far side of the lot, a figure stumbled forward, coughing. It was Ethan Maddox, the former police captain, whose body cam had been turned off the night Maya's brother was arrested and never came home. For years, he had smirked through hearings, pointed to statistics, and deflected outrage. But last week, someone published the Auditon internal report buried for 5 years, which showed he authorized transfers of underage detainees without proper oversight. Overnight, Ethan's name trended not with medals but with grave markers. His neighbors stopped waving. His gym canceled his membership for safety concerns. His daughter's college rescinded his scholarship endowment. The town he once patrolled now looked through him, not at him. And when he approached the wooden board Malik had just nailed in place, no one moved to make space. He stood outside the circle, irrelevant. Malik finished tightening the last nail. The sound it made a clean puncture, followed by a brief quiver hung in the air like a note held too long. Around him, the crowd wasn't applauding. They weren't chanting. They weren't filming for clout. They were simply witnessing. Not performance, not a protest, but presence. Each breath they took confirmed something had shifted. Not enough to undo what had been done, but just enough to make space for what might come next. Malik stepped back and looked at the board one final time. One word burned into it: firewall. Beneath it, smeared in charcoal and truth, a single sentence: not to fight fire, but to stop it from burning what remains human. There was no line of cameras perched on tripods, no mayor in a suit rehearsing sound bites, no child conscripted to snip a ribbon while adults clapped for something they never bled to build. Instead, there was sawdust clinging to calloused palms, rust flaking off a beam that had once held up a condemned school gym, and the dry grind of effort echoing beneath a patched metal roof. The center didn't rise in defiance of neglect, it grew through it, like moss through cracks, slow but certain. The blueprints were scrawled in the margins of eviction notices and the backside corners of food pantry receipts. The foundation was leveled using borrowed shovels and a wheelbarrow with a cracked tire. No permit had been issued, and no one came to stop them, not because the city approved, but because the city had already turned its back. They were building in the blind spot of bureaucracy, and that gave them time just enough to finish what had been started. The windows, what remained of them, were fitted with mesh screens instead of glass, a lesson learned from last summer when bricks had shattered the front of the wellness co-op under the cover of night. The official statement called it a random act of vandalism, but everyone knew it wasn't random. The man who'd thrown the first rock, Lars Benton, a former deputy turned bar owner, had posted just hours before. Places like that make neighborhoods soft. He had laughed when the footage surfaced. His laugh had the jagged shape of confidence born from impunity. But 2 days later, a group of mothers, none of them armed, stood in silence outside his bar. They wore shirts with the names of every child who had spent time in that co-op's crisis room. No slogans, no shouting, just presence. For 11 nights, they returned, saying nothing. His bar emptied. His liquor distributor canceled the contract. His landlord raised the rent. Lars left town before the 12th night. Inside the center, they had rewired the generator by hand. Kareem's old laptop sat tethered by a frayed cord, still booting slower than memory, but still booting. On the wall above it, someone had taped the last photo taken before the school board meeting imploded. Maya, eyes locked on Councilwoman Riggs, who had sneered, "This town doesn't need a sanctuary for delinquents." The recording caught the pause, the room shifting like a held breath, and then Maya's reply, "You're mistaking broken systems for broken people." That phrase spread, etched on locker doors, carved into park benches, but Riggs, who once hosted donor brunches beneath portraits of her grandfather himself a segregationist judge, found herself increasingly alone. The parent alliance she led fractured after the superintendent admitted Riggs had pushed to rezone 3 neighborhoods to limit minority enrollment. Her staff resigned. Her husband filed for separation. The local paper unearthed old text gold, clipped instructions to remove bilingual signage, and cut funding for any program with equity in the title. She denied nothing. "People are too emotional," she said on live radio, but no one was listening by then. Her mic was still on, but her voice no longer landed. In the north hallway of the center, remnants of riot shields had been repurposed into shelvish holding books, not batons. They were bolted beside a mural of Aaliyah Jones, painted in muted greens and stormy violets. Aaliyah, who'd once taught poetry in the abandoned lot next to the freeway, had been shoved to the ground during a routine sweep the night the curfew was enacted. The officer, Miles Harkey, claimed she had reached into her bag too quickly. He had not known she was carrying notebooks, not weapons. Her injuries weren't fatal, but the silence that followed nearly was. For weeks, not one city official spoke her name. But then the footage surfaced, slow motion, grainy, undeniable. Harkey was placed on administrative leave. The mayor called it an unfortunate lapse in judgment, but judgment shifted. Students at Eastview High wore tape over their mouths and wrote her name across their arms in permanent marker. Her face was projected onto the side of City Hall with a quote, "They don't want us silent. They want us gone." Harkey filed a defamation suit. He lost. The judge cited the video. The department refused to reinstate him. No precinct in the county would touch him after that. He now delivered food in a borrowed truck, and when he approached houses in that same neighborhood, doors closed before he reached the step. Back in the main atrium, Malik climbed the scaffolding with the speaker in hand. He had found it in the back of Kareem's truck, next to an old duffel of circuit boards and a spool of Ethernet cable that no one remembered wiring. It still worked. He mounted it to the rafter with a belt and whispered a prayer not meant for words. Outside, the chalk outlines began to grow, drawn not by coroners but children. Instead of silhouettes of loss, they traced shapes of what they dreamed to become. One a firefighter, another a pilot, one with wings too wide for the concrete to contain. Malik stood beneath the rig, breathing slowly, then hit play. The sound crackled to life. Kareem's voice, uneven but resolute. "Justice doesn't have a shape, it only has memory." The words poured out like oil over flame, slow and hot and impossible to ignore. The crowd went still. Even the wind quieted, and in that moment, every corner of the center felt sentient, like the beams could hear, like the rafters held their breath. And as the message faded, the stillness wasn't hollow, it was charged. Malik stepped back down and walked toward the entry gates, where the last wall of the courtyard remained unfinished. There, veterans lined up shoulder to shoulder, measuring distance between studs using twine and instinct. Some had once diffused IEDs with trembling fingers, others had returned from deployment to find foreclosure notices stapled to their childhood homes. They knew what it meant to build from ruin. Nearby, mothers waited with coolers, handing out bottles of water, passing folded towels to kids with sweat on their necks. One mother, whose daughter had been expelled for recording a teacher's racist outburst, now handed out notebooks with her child's name embossed on the cover. Another, whose son had disappeared for 5 hours in a transport glitch after being detained without cause, pressed her palm gently to the shoulder of a boy who flinched when sirens passed. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Veterans built training rigs out of scrap. Mothers stood at the gates handing out water and wisdom. The sun leaned low over the rust-stained hills, casting long shadows from the broken gravestones behind the church, where names had been weathered away and faith had outlived architecture. Maya's hands, thick with earth, moved slowly through the clay, turning, loosening, folding it over itself like memory kneaded into permanence. Her sleeves were rolled above the elbow, revealing a lattice of healed scars that no longer asked for sympathy. The ground here hadn't grown anything in years, not since the last drought, but she kept working it anyway, not for harvest, but for rhythm. Her boots pressed deeper with every motion, grounding her in something older than systems, older than even truth. The shovel's worn handle creaked in her grip as the dry soil yielded inch by inch, giving way not to seeds, but to silence that had purpose. The woman stood watching her for a long while. Her uniform bore no insignia now, only faint stitching where emblems had been removed, stripped, not by decree, but by choice. She had left rank behind 2 months ago, walked out of a briefing where the words collateral containment had been used to describe a school gymnasium. That recording, leaked by an unnamed analyst, had ignited a brief, brutal firestorm. For 48 hours, it consumed screens across the nation. A voice-flat, male-controlled said, "You'll get 40% casualties. Acceptable if we neutralize the rhetorical centers." One clip, 14 seconds, enough to melt a dozen careers, but none of the men who said it faced charges. They held press conferences instead, denied nothing, admitted nothing. One offered a resigned sigh and said, "History will sort it out." His resignation letter was framed in the new defense lobby's headquarters a week later. His name, Brent Maddox, still trended every few days, mostly alongside the word coward. The woman's voice cracked slightly as she spoke again. "They told us you went off-grid, said you lost perspective." Her eyes drifted across the church, where bullet holes had been patched with rusted tin and prayers in Spanish were still scratched into the siding with keys. One read, "Protege los que ya no pueden correr." Protect those who can no longer run. Maya didn't answer. Her hands moved again, steady as breath. The dirt clung to her fingers like it recognized her. In the distance, a car backfired, startling a cluster of birds into flight from a skeletal tree. The woman flinched. She still had reflexes tuned to sound, to threat, to aftermath, but she no longer reached for a weapon. She hadn't touched one since they shut down Project Cormorant. After the final debrief, her supervisor handed her a coin-sized chip and said, "No future psychological viability." It was supposed to be a quiet dismissal, but the note ended up in Appendix C of the final report. And that note, like all digital truths, found its way into public hands.